Okay, so welcome to this next video in which we are discussing tertiary lymphoid organogenesis. Okay, so we've now had a review of the immune responses, both the innate immune response or the acute inflammatory response and the adaptive immune response. And we've seen that many different cell types are going to be recruited to this inflamed tissue. So we've seen macrophages, neutrophils were recruited in the innate immune response, and then we also had T cell recruitment in the adaptive immune response. Now, in some immune responses, you can get to an extent plasma cell recruitment, but as a general rule, the plasma cells are called plasma cells because they stay within the blood. Okay, so what is tertiary lymphoid organogenesis and how is it induced by this chronic inflammation state? Okay, so tertiary lymphoid organogenesis is basically the production of a structure very similar to a secondary lymphoid organ in the inflamed site, basically. Okay, so let me explain what a primary and secondary lymphoid organ are. So firstly, let's start off with a primary lymphoid organ. So a lymphoid organ is an organ that contains lymphocytes, basically. Okay, so primary lymphoid organ. So the primary lymphoid organs are organs which are involved in the production of lymphocytes and the maturation of lymphocytes. So the primary tissue which creates lymphocytes is the bone marrow. Okay, so the bone marrow creates all lymphocytes. It creates both T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. However, the T lymphocytes leave the bone marrow early on and go on to mature in the thymus, whereas the B lymphocytes, take that M out, thymus gland, okay, whereas the B lymphocytes, they remain in the bone marrow and mature in the bone marrow. Okay, so both the bone marrow and the thymus gland are considered primary lymphoid organs because the bone marrow is involved in the production of the lymphocytes and also the maturation of the B lymphocytes, and the thymus gland is involved in the maturation of the T lymphocytes. Okay, so this is what T lymphocytes will do when they're in the thymocyte stage, okay, which of their development. Right, okay, so a secondary lymphoid organ is an organ which stores mature lymphocytes which have never seen antigen yet. Okay, so they are the naive T cells and the naive B cells. Okay, so examples of secondary lymphoid organs are lymph nodes, which are full with naive T cells, both CD4 positive and CD8 positive naive T cells, and also B cells which have never seen antigen either, so naive B cells. Okay, so lymph nodes are absolutely full of lymphocytes, and also the spleen is a secondary lymphoid organ. So the spleen has portions of it which store white blood cells, known as the white pulp of the spleen. It also is a major store for red blood cells, but in amongst the red blood cells are stores of white blood cells, and these have both T lymphocytes of both the CD4 positive and CD8 positive form, and also B lymphocytes as well. Okay, so a tertiary lymphoid organ, also often abbreviated to TLO, is basically the production of something very similar to a secondary lymphoid organ at this point, at this area of chronic inflammation. So, if you have a tissue which is inflamed for an extremely long period of time, then what you can get happening is you can get the formation of new huge great stores of naive T cells and also naive B cells. And this is what's known as a tertiary lymphoid organ. Okay, now you might ask, well, why are they moving to this site? Well, the reality is that you don't have fixed T and B cells. So let me draw you a picture of a lymph node, and which is obviously the key example of a secondary lymphoid organ, and we'll discuss this more when I've got this picture up. So let's draw a picture of a lymph node. So here is the efferent lymph vessel, the big vessel which has the lymph flowing out. And then we have a huge number of afferent lymph vessels, which are blood vessels which are coming in. Okay, so here is an afferent lymph vessel, here's another afferent lymph vessel, here's another one, okay, and then another one over here. Right, okay, so these are the afferent lymph vessels, so let me add that in. So these are the lymph vessels which are draining lymph fluid into the lymph node, okay, and you have many afferent lymph vessels which are bringing lymph in, and then you have a single efferent lymph vessel which is taking lymph out of the lymph node. Okay, right, so around the edge of the lymph node you have what's known as the subcapsular sinus. Okay, so this is a sort of gap where lymph is going to be stored, basically. So lymph will come in from all 5 of these afferent lymph vessels that I've shown, and you'll most likely have far more than that in the actual lymph node, but 5 was the number I could bear to draw. Okay, and I'll colour this all in turquoise. So this is just one confluent space, basically. The lymph will come in and then it will go into this great store of lymph, this sort of chamber of lymph which is around the outside of the lymph node. And this is what's known as the subcapsular, because it's just underneath the capsule sinus, and sinus means a fluid-filled hole, basically. Okay, so this is the subcapsular sinus. Okay, now what's going to happen is that underneath the subcapsular sinus you have stores of lymphocytes, basically. So you have what's known firstly as the cortex of the lymph node, okay, and this consists of a huge number of T cells, basically. And in amongst the cortex of the lymph node you also have these follicles which are filled with B cells. So spheres of B cells are dotted in amongst the T cells. Okay, so these are known as the B cell follicles here. So this is a B cell follicle, and these are amongst the cortex of the lymph node. So this is the cortex. Okay, and cortex means around the outside. So this is the outer bit of the lymph node, and it consists of absolutely loads of T cells. So these in-between bits, which I'll colour in pink, so these bits here, these consist of absolutely loads of T cells, and then those follicles are spheres of B cells. So in orange here, these consist of spheres of B cells. Okay, right. Then, more medially than the cortex, you then have the paracortex, so more viscerally would have probably been the better word than medially. Okay, so this then is the paracortex of the lymph node. Where can I label that up? I'm struggling to find space here. So this is what's known as the paracortex of the lymph node. Okay, and again this is absolutely full of T cells. And then you come into this central sinus here, which is known as the medullary sinus. So again, this is a sinus which is full of lymph. So what has to happen basically is the lymph comes in through the afferent lymph vessels and then goes into the subcapsular sinus, and then to get to the medullary sinus at the centre and then out to the efferent vessel, then it has to percolate through the cortex and the paracortex, which have loads of T cells and B cells in. Okay, so that centre bit is known as the medullary sinus, which is prior to the efferent lymph vessel. Okay, right. So, why have I drawn this picture? Well, basically, in the cortex and the paracortex, there is a type of venule known as a high endothelial venule And I just want to discuss with you what a high endothelial venule is, because this is going to be very important in the discussion of tertiary lymphoid organogenesis. Okay, so it's known as a high endothelial venule, and for short, people often denote high endothelial venules as HEVs, okay, for high endothelial venules. Now, these are blood vessels within the cortex and the paracortex, okay, and basically what's special about them, the reason they're called high endothelial venules, is if we draw a picture of one here. So we've started with a tube, that's always a good starting point if you're drawing a blood vessel. And then basically they have a really odd endothelium. Okay, so remember, venules consist of merely an endothelial cell layer surrounded by a basement membrane. Okay, so here's the basement membrane in turquoise at the edge, which remember mainly consists of the protein collagen, but also has other proteins such as laminins and fibrillin within it. Okay, and then sitting on the basement membrane are the endothelial cells. But basically, in these high endothelial venules, you have very odd endothelial cells. So a normal capillary, in fact, that's probably a good idea. Let's compare it to a normal venule, not a normal capillary. A normal venule would look like this. It would have these normal looking endothelial cells which are very, very flat, basically. They're squamous cells, they're flat, pressed flat against the basement membrane. Whereas the endothelial cells of this high endothelial venule, those are not pressed flat. They're high, basically. They are tall cells. And that's the origin of the name of these blood vessels, high endothelial venules, because the endothelial cells are very, very tall. Okay, now what happens is the naive T cells, both CD8 positive and CD4 positive, and also the naive B cells, are continuously coming into the cortex and the paracortex of the lymph node via the high endothelial venules. So you'll have naive T cells and naive B cells that are within the blood that decide, okay, we'd like to come and sit in this lymph node for a while. And they will enter via the high endothelial venules. So they come out from the bloodstream via the high endothelial venules and go into the cortex and the paracortex. Now they might sit there for, a good deal of time, and then they'll decide, actually, I want to move off now, I want to go somewhere else. So basically, naive T cells and naive B cells are not stuck sitting in a lymph node forever waiting for an antigen presenting cell. No, they have slightly more interesting lives than that. They can go into one lymph node and then they can decide, actually I want to move on, and they can go back into the blood via these special venules, these high endothelial venules, and then they can circulate round in the blood for a bit, find another secondary lymphoid organ, such as another lymph node, or indeed another spleen, well, not another spleen, or indeed they can go into the spleen, which also has these high endothelial venules. Okay, and basically they can move around. So what happens at your chronically inflamed site is that the post-capillary venules that supply that inflamed area become high endothelial venules. Their endothelium undergoes a change where it adopts a structure like this, and they then become capable of moving these naive T cells and naive B cells from the blood into that inflamed tissue, and also moving the naive T cells and B cells back out of the inflamed tissue and into the blood. So effectively you set up another secondary lymphoid organ out at your inflamed tissue site, and this is what's known as a tertiary lymphoid organ. Okay, so now we've discussed what it actually is. It's this accumulation of T cells and B cells that are both naive. They've never seen antigen. And I want to stress this. They are not anything to do with this immune response, because remember, the immune response that we've initiated, we've selected T cells and B cells that are specific for the antigens that we are targeting, these T cells and B cells that you can be bringing in through these high endothelial venules that you're going to make, those will just be, they'll just be randomers. They won't at all necessarily be directed against antigens that this pathogen actually has. So they might be directed against completely different pathogens. Okay, but they're still coming into the inflamed site, and you get huge huge masses of these naive T cells and naive B cells at your inflamed site, even though those naive T cells and B cells have nothing to do with actually fighting the infection. Okay, so we'll continue this discussion in the next video.